Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling some pretty big talked about ideas, specifically those in Robert Malone's book, Lies My Gov't Told Me and the Better Future Coming.
Right. It's a book that casts a very wide net over the COVID-19 pandemic, government responses, and what might be next.
And it's important to remember he's coming at this from a specific place, isn't he? Background in biodefense, vaccinology.
Exactly. That's his lens.
Yeah.
So he has a particular expertise he's drawing on.
Absolutely. And for you listening, if you want the gist without getting totally overwhelmed by a long book, that's our mission here.
Yeah, we're going to try and pull out the core arguments, the main insights from Malone's perspective, get you the essence.
Think of it as the highlights reel, but, with context.
And it's worth flagging up front, the book itself includes different voices. You've got endorsements from Dr. Meryl Nass, a physician, and Professor Matthias Desmet, a clinical psychologist.
So it's setting up a discussion with multiple facets right from the start.
Definitely suggests we're not looking at just one narrow viewpoint within the book itself.
Okay, so let's start with Malone himself, the author. What's his story? Significant scientific background, right? Biodefense, vaccine.
That's the foundation,
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting is how he describes his own evolution, I guess.
How so?
Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. writes in the foreword that Malone looked back and sort of admitted, I never really allowed myself to confront the possibility that we might not be the good guys.
That implies quite a shift, doesn't it? From maybe an insider perspective to something else.
Seems like it. And it wasn't like he was seeking the limelight before the pandemic.
No, the book paints a picture of him and his wife, Dr. Jill Glasspool-Malone, living pretty quietly, Virginia horse farm, kids grown.
Right, a settled life. But then COVID hits, and their experiences during that time, well, the book frames that as the catalyst.
The thing that pushed him into the public eye and led to writing this.
Exactly. He really emphasizes their commitment to things like integrity, dignity, community. Those are presented as the driving forces.
And his wife, Jill, seems absolutely central to this whole project.
Oh, definitely. The dedication to her is really striking. He calls her his partner and everything, says her contribution was, at least as big as his.
And her background is pretty relevant too, right? PhDs in biotech and public policy.
Yeah, that mix of science and policy understanding seems crucial to the arguments in the book. Malone mentions they almost finish each other's sentences, that the book just wouldn't exist without her.
So it's very much presented as a joint intellectual effort.
Absolutely. He wants you to get that.
Okay, so understanding that context, let's dive into one of the book's biggest claims. This idea of government censorship and propaganda during the pandemic.
Yeah, this is really a cornerstone of his argument. He's claiming governments, related groups, they deliberately censored stuff, spread lies, or what he sees as lies, and basically obscured information.
He even points to that UN official, Melissa Fleming, talking about working with Google on climate change info.
Right, to prioritize UN resources in search results. Malone uses that as an example of trying to, quote, own the science.
And connects it to a wider worry about who controls the information flow.
Yeah, the underlying concern seems to be if you silence the alternative voices, the scientists, the journalists who disagree, you end up with a skewed history.
A revisionist history, potentially.
Yeah, and he worries that this official story, boosted by big tech, leaves us less prepared for the next crisis and keeps, the people he thinks were wrong in charge.
He talks about his own experience early on trying to self-publish a guide.
And running into what he calls Orwellian collusion. WHO, US government, booksellers, all seemingly working together against him.
Which sounds like a pretty rough introduction to trying to get information out there, sets a tone.
For sure. It shapes his whole perspective. He also mentions this Malone doctrine principles, others apparently derive from his statements.
Highlighting his own alarm, this vertigo he felt facing what he saw as misinformation.
Exactly. And then there's that FOIA data point, $1 billion.
$1 billion from HHS CDC spent on, promoting the vaccine message and fighting misinformation.
And funneling it to major news outlets, ABC, NBC, Washington Post, LA Times.
Allegedly without disclosing that it was taxpayer money funding those messages.
Which, raises pretty big questions about transparency and government influence on media narratives during a health crisis. Malone definitely sees it as a deliberate shaping of public opinion.
He argues this ties into a historical pattern, using fear to control people.
Yeah, he lists various fears promoted over the decades: enemies, diseases, Y2K.
And contrasts that with, mundane risks. Accidents at home kill more people, but they don't create mass panic.
It's a point about narrative focus, isn't it? What gets amplified. Then he makes this quite strong comparison to Stalin's Soviet Union.
How so?
The climate of fear, the secret police, informants controlling the truth, people informing on each other just to survive. He's drawing a parallel about controlling information through fear.
It's a provocative comparison, certainly, which leads into his points about how people offering different views were treated.
Right, the persecution of, as he sees them, truth-tellers. Dr. Meryl Naz's story is a key example for him.
What happened there?
Medical board suspension. Not for harming a patient, there were no patient complaints, but for offering treatments she believed in and talking about them.
And they made her get a neuropsych exam.
Yeah, seems pretty intense, very unusual.
Malone also brings up his own history, fighting the anthrax vaccine mandate years ago.
He actually won that in court, but then the DoD used an emergency use authorization, an EUA, to basically get around the ruling.
So he's painting a picture of long-standing conflict with health authorities over mandates.
Provides context for his later stance. And then there's the whole issue of repurposed drugs. Chloroquine, ivermectin.
He cites early studies, right? Lab studies showing chloroquine worked against the original SARS back in 2005 and MERS in 2014, in vitro, so in the lab.
Yeah, suggesting there was some early scientific basis for looking into these. With ivermectin, he argues there was some initial hesitation to just dismiss it.
But
as prescriptions went up, he claims the authorities got nervous and started cracking down, allegedly threatening doctors' licenses.
And he points to the main board's reason for suspending Dr. Nas. Basically, ivermectin wasn't FDA approved for COVID.
Which highlights that whole tension around off-label use and board authority. He contrasts all this pushback against cheap repurposed drugs with the heavy promotion of expensive remdesivir.
He does mention a positive study too, though, fluvoxamine.
Yeah, a Lancet study suggesting it reduced mortality and hospitalization. Another potential tool that maybe didn't get the spotlight, in his view.
And his own run-in with the Chicago Reader.
Right, tried to publish a column, facing censorship, external fact-checkers, basically rewriting it, ending in a fight over control. That personal experience clearly fuels his concerns.
It makes sense. Okay, let's pivot slightly to a more theoretical concept he uses, mass formation psychology.
Yeah, he leans heavily on Matthias Desmet's work here. The idea is that large groups can kind of fall under a spell, develop this shared, sometimes irrational belief system, almost like hypnosis.
A way to understand the collective response during the pandemic.
That's how Malone uses it. And he links this to a potential new kind of totalitarianism, not driven by obvious dictators, but by
dull bureaucrats and technocrats. That's his phrase. It's quite an image.
It is. He argues that mass manipulation techniques, propaganda theories from Lippmann, Trotter, Bernays, even brainwashing concepts are being deployed, even in democracies.
And the effect of this mass formation is?
It makes the dominant narrative almost immune to facts or logic, he claims. People find paradoxical ways to justify harmful measures.
Like lockdowns causing isolation deaths being used to argue for more restriction.
Exactly, a self-reinforcing loop. He also mentions the UN warning about lockdown-induced famines, worrying those deaths might get blamed on COVID, feeding the fear.
Okay, let's look at some specific data he brings into the argument. Insurance company figures, potential vaccine issues.
This is where he presents some pretty startling numbers. Major insurers seeing huge jumps in fourth quarter 2021 loss ratios, like 25% to 45% higher than 2019.
And disability claims rising too, second half of 21.
Yeah. And his hypothesis connects this directly to the rollout of corporate vaccine mandates in fall 2021.
Why then?
His reasoning is that this working age group, the ones seeing the rise in death and disability claims, weren't hit as hard by COVID itself in 2020 before the vaccines were widespread and mandated.
And he links this to official labor stats, the FRED graph.
Right, data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showing a noticeable uptick in people reporting disabilities starting mid-2021. Now, correlation isn't causation, obviously.
But he presents it as a major red flag requiring investigation.
Definitely. He also briefly touches on the idea that central banks and big corporations exploited the crisis.
Not a huge focus, but it's there.
It's there. He accuses corporate media and big tech of being complicit in censorship, even calling them accessories to wrongful death.
Strong words.
Very. He predicts a massive loss of trust. because of all this and the NIH, CDC, FDA, politicians, doctors, media, pretty much all institutions.
Which brings us to his critique of scientism. How does he define that?
He draws on thinkers like Hayek and Popper. Basically, it's either trusting science methods too much, applying them where they don't fit, or it's like a superficial imitation of science, pretending something's scientific when it's not following the actual process.
And he sees the government's vaccine policies as an example of this scientist.
Yes. He points to that children's health defense lawsuit against Facebook, claiming Facebook censored vaccine criticism at the government's request.
And Facebook admitted in court their fact checks are just opinions.
He highlights that admission, yeah. Raises questions about what fact-checking actually means on these platforms.
He's also critical of the CDC itself.
Calls them a leading purveyor of misinformation on vaccines, citing a Cochrane collaboration critique of the CDC's universal flu shot advice as an example.
And he alleges direct collusion. Fauci, Zuckerberg, CDC.
Yeah, working together to control the COVID narrative, suppress misinformation, potentially violating the First Amendment in the process. He specifically labels Fauci America's high priest of scientism.
Meaning Fauci substituted his opinion for actual science, in Malone's view.
That's the accusation. Strong critique. He then tries to clarify the difference between real science and this scientism.
How does he define real science?
As a process. Hypothesis, experiment, data, analysis, but crucially, critical discussion, peer review, challenge.
Right.
Feedback is key. Conflicting results aren't failures. They lead to more questions, more investigation. That's science.
Whereas scientism just dismisses dissent.
Often using faulty logic, like the no true Scotsman fallacy. Oh, anyone who disagrees isn't a real scientist.
Got it. The book also gets specific about the mRNA vaccines themselves.
He gives a bit of history on gene therapy. First, early setbacks, the Jesse Gelsinger tragedy in '99 due to experimental issues, kind of setting the stage.
Then he looks at how fact-checkers talked about the spike protein from the vaccines.
Yeah, he quotes factcheck.org, PolitiFact, Associated Press, all basically saying the spike protein generated by the vaccine is harmless or safe. He presents these quotes, implying a contrast with potential risks he discusses later.
Like the Omicron variant.
He discusses Omicron possibly evading vaccine immunity and maybe even dampening the immune response to itself, raising questions about the initial vaccine's long-term strategy.
And the data on effectiveness against Omicron.
He acknowledges 2-3 doses offered some protection against severe disease, but says effectiveness varied, and plenty of fully vaccinated people still ended up hospitalized.
Which leads to the booster debate for younger adults.
Right. He references risk-benefit analyses from universities that question the ethics of mandates for young adults based on the data before the bivalent boosters came out.
He also criticizes an NIH study on vitamin D.
Claims they used a flawed study to dismiss the link between vitamin D levels and COVID outcomes. Suggests scientific bias, and keeps returning to the idea that effective early treatments were available but discouraged. This whole section reinforces his core skepticism about the official vaccine narrative and the downplaying of other approaches. And then there's the issue of data transparency.
Or lack thereof, in his view.
Exactly. He accuses the CDC of using cumulative data misleadingly to inflate vaccine effectiveness against Omicron and of hiding safety data.
He mentions that Lancet paper analyzing V8 years data again,
highlighting the reported rate of serious adverse events, including death. He also notes how few independent peer-reviewed studies on mRNA vaccine impacts existed initially outside of manufacturer trials.
And he flags conflicts of interest.
Big time. CDC authors publishing papers on vaccine safety, he sees that as a major conflict given the agency's role in promoting the vaccines.
And getting compensation for vaccine injuries is hard.
Through the CICP program, yes. He says the burden of proof is incredibly high and alleges the CDC withholds data that could help claimants.
So the picture he paints is one of opacity, potential conflicts, and difficulty getting accountability.
That's the thrust of it, which logically leads into his concerns about government overreach and eroding freedoms.
Starts with the White House reaching out to Silicon Valley early on, March 2020.
Yeah, asking for help fighting the virus and misinformation. Malone sees that as raising red flags about government influencing private platforms right from the start.
He talks about the Overton window being manipulated.
The range of acceptable debate. He argues government, media, social media, big tech all worked to deliberately narrow that window when it came to COVID science.
And the use of fear in messaging.
He highlights it consistently. Even notes some UK government advisors later regretted using unethical fear tactics.
Yeah.
It points to a Danish newspaper apologizing for just repeating the government line without question.
Then he brings in the Great Reset idea. How does he frame that?
As a blueprint for a corporate takeover, basically. Using a global technocratic biosecurity state-restricting movement, forcing digitization, losing bodily autonomy. It's a big, sweeping theory.
A very alarming one. And vaccine passports fit into this how?
He sees them as a step toward a digital ID, leading eventually to a social credit system to manage behavior. He uses the Canadian trucker protest and the government freezing bank accounts as an example of this kind of control being weaponized.
Okay, this connects to his arguments about corporate power and regulatory capture.
Yes. He talks about agencies like the FDA and CDC getting industry funding, relying on industry trials for approvals, classic regulatory capture concerns.
He gives an example. ERAS, the TB Vaccine Foundation.
Hiring a PR firm to place positive stories, even in The Economist, just illustrating how narratives can be actively managed and planted. He includes anecdotes from journalists who felt they had to leave mainstream media because of censorship and propaganda pushing.
And foundation funding. Gates Foundation, for instance.
Points out they give huge amounts to media outlets, raising questions about potential influence on coverage. It's all part of this ecosystem of influence he's describing.
He brings up stakeholder capitalism, Klaus Schwab's concept.
Positions it as the ideology driving the mismanagement of the pandemic response.
Calls it a form of corporatism.
And dangerous to democracy.
That's his argument. Draws parallels to historical corporatist regimes. Mentions the WEF vision, you'll own nothing and be happy. Controlled by megacorp. Free speech seen as a threat.
This all feeds into his critique of the administrative state.
The unelected bureaucracy. He worries about its growing power, its lack of accountability. Talks about inverted totalitarianism power, held by unseen bureaucrats, elected leaders, just fronts.
He defines fascism simply as the fusion of corporate and state power.
And argues that's what we're increasingly seeing. He points to things like congressionally chartered nonprofits and the Bayh-Dole Act helping the medical pharma complex influence the NIH and CDC.
Which is Schedule F. Yeah, that potential classification change that could have made it easier to fire federal employees, allowing a president to remake the bureaucracy, shows the stakes involved in controlling the administrative state.
He keeps hitting this theme of HHS agencies withholding data, aligning with pharma interests.
Yeah, and sees the attempts to change the WHO's international health regulations in 2022 as a direct threat to U.S. sovereignty, driven by this administrative state.
Uses Fauci's congressional testimony as an example.
Of perceived arrogance, lack of accountability from these powerful administrators, draws parallels to past government overreach, normalization of covert actions. It's a deep critique of the structure of modern governance.
So after laying out all these concerns, where does he suggest we go from here? Any paths forward?
Well, the primary call is for critical thinking, for individuals to analyze information themselves, not just accept official narratives.
Makes sense.
He stresses the importance of independent media, alternative social platforms, as ways to push back against this inverted totalitarianism, and public pressure on search engines to stop manipulation.
He's critical of the UN, too. Biological Weapons Convention.
Yeah, sees them as complicit, points out the treaty has no teeth, no real enforcement. He also highlights Apocrity.org in Italy as a positive example.
What do they do?
An organization focused on patient-centered care, individual health responsibility, supporting doctors who faced persecution for using alternative treatments. Kind of grassroots resistance.
And victory gardens.
Yeah, promotes that as a form of practical resistance, becoming a producer, not just a consumer, pushing back against globalist control of food supplies. Small acts of independence.
So the overall message is about resilience.
Resilience, building community, critical thinking, and basic kindness, actually. That's how the book wraps up its call to action.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive into lies my Gov't told me, we've hit Malone's core arguments about, government censorship, the suppression of dissent and early treatments, mass formation.
And his concerns about vaccine data, scientism versus real science, the influence of corporations and the administrative state, regulatory capture.
Well,
it's a lot.
It really is. We've tried to give you the main threads of his thinking.
And fundamentally, his message throughout is, question everything. Think for yourself. Don't just take the official story at face value.
Right. And maybe a final thought for you listening. As you process all this, consider those concepts: mass formation, technocratic control, individual sovereignty. How do you see them playing out in the world around you today? What does that mean for the future?
Definitely something to chew on.